Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining today's Disaster Housing Recovery Coalition National Call. We are going to get started in just a minute. We'll give folks some time to log in. And so we will start in just about 1 minute. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining today's national call for the Disaster Housing Recovery Coalition. This is a coalition of 850 national, state, and local organizations, including many that are working directly with disaster-impacted communities and with firsthand experience recovering from a disaster. Our coalition works to ensure that federal disaster recovery efforts reach all impacted households, including those with the lowest incomes and those who are most marginalized, who are often hardest hit by disasters but face the longest, steepest path to recovery. On today's call, we're going to hear about how federal, state, and local governments are responding to the housing needs after hurricanes Ian and Fiona. We're going to hear from leaders who are working on disaster recovery efforts. And we're going to learn about legislation that we have endorsed that will help move us to a more complete and equitable recovery. Just as a reminder, these calls are weekly on Tuesdays at 2 p.m. We also have working group calls where we can dig into the details more and have more discussion. Our disaster working group calls are on Wednesdays, where we talk more in depth about the recovery framework and opportunities for reforms. And we have a Puerto Rico working group on Thursdays. I want to start off before we go into our agenda to share a big win for the Disaster Housing Recovery Coalition. Yesterday, HUD announced that they are creating a rapid unsheltered survivor housing program, RUSH, which will help the lowest income and most marginalized disaster survivors either regain or maintain their housing following a disaster. This announcement comes after at least 5 years of advocacy from the DHRC, pushing for longer-term resources to help the lowest income disaster survivors maintain housing. Under the new RUSH program, survivors will be provided longer-term rental assistance for up to 24 months, supportive services covering move-in expenses, outreach costs, and other needs that are faced by people experiencing homelessness. It's a major victory for all of us, and I want to thank all of you for your advocacy over the last several years. As you know, we have seen increased homelessness in many communities following a disaster. In large part, that's because the existing affordable housing crisis is exacerbated by disasters, and because FEMA programs are often inaccessible to people with the lowest incomes. And so we are really excited to see that this program has been stood up by HUD, also in large part because FEMA has refused to activate other programs like the Disaster Housing Assistance Program, on which RUSH is modeled in recent years. And so we're so glad to see that HUD is stepping in to fill in the need for the lowest income survivors. We're going to have more details on this in next week's call, where we'll have a HUD official join us to go over in more detail what the RUSH program will include. But we do know for now that the first allocation of almost $7 million is going out to the state of Florida and several communities there, several counties there. And we are going to be paying very, very close attention to how this program is being implemented. We want to make sure that it is working as successfully as possible so that we can advocate for a more permanent funding stream, ideally from FEMA's DRF fund or Disaster Recovery Fund going forward, so that we can really serve people at the scale that's needed. My colleagues are going to share in the chat box a link to our press statement. They already did, responding to the announcement about the new RUSH program. And I hope you'll join with us next week when we hear from HUD Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Community Planning and Development. It's a long title. but she oversees disaster recovery at HUD, and she's going to share more details with us about RUSH. So with that, we can go into our agenda. We're going to start with Jeannie Ortiz, who's from the Young Lawyers Division of the American Bar Association. And I'll turn it over to you, Jeannie.
Great. Thanks so much, Sarah. And I do have slides. Yep. Excellent. All right. Well, first of all, thank you so much to the National Low Income Housing Coalition team for the opportunity to join you all today. I have been asked to provide an overview of the American Bar Association Young Lawyers Division Disaster Legal Services Program, which is an effort that supports disaster legal responses all over the country. The National Low Income Housing Coalition team also has these slides, so if anyone would like them, please feel free to request a copy. Next slide. So my name is Jeannie Ortiz, and I am joining you all today from New York. I am the Volunteer Vice Director of Programming at the ABA's Disaster Legal Services Program. I've been a part of the program for almost 5 years now, and my job is to support the operations of an agreement that the American Bar Association has with the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, to provide free and temporary legal services to people who have been impacted by climate disasters. And in my day job, I work for a nonprofit organization called Pro Bono Net that also does some disaster response and recovery work. And that explains my email, which is on the last slide. Next slide. So some of you may already be familiar with this graphic or a variation of it, but I think it is a really good summary of legal issues arising out of disasters. This is an updated version of a diagram that was created in the aftermath of the 2017 major disasters to help educate pro bono attorneys and other legal advocates on the most common legal issues that families face in the weeks, months, and years following a disaster event. And through our program, we primarily support disaster survivors with legal issues in the short-term and medium-term categories, which includes housing and FEMA appeal cases, very common issues after a major disaster. And because of these legal issues, the American Bar Association, the Disaster Legal Services Program was created actually in the aftermath of Hurricane Camille back in 1969 to encourage pro bono attorney engagement to help disaster survivors with their legal problems. Next slide. So the DLS program has been operating for nearly 50 years, and it is entirely run by volunteer attorneys across the country. Its primary purpose is, like I said, to provide free legal services to survivors of a federally declared major disaster, meaning that the declaration has been approved by the President of the United States after the governor of the impacted area has requested a major disaster declaration. Next slide. This program is possible thanks to the support of many people. So within the American Bar Association, our work is primarily divided in two ways. The first one is we have volunteer attorneys that make up the DLS program. Our team meets with FEMA on an ongoing basis to share back any lessons learned from the disaster legal implementations over the past year. We also offer training as needed in different regions, and support organizations that are providing free legal services to people affected by a disaster. We also have ABA district representatives around the country who make sure that the disaster plans that we have on file are updated every year, and who work with organizations to set up hotlines and provide those free legal services. As part of our work, we organize calls to discuss disaster legal services, and we also have FEMA representatives join us to share updates on the agency's disaster response efforts, data on FEMA registrations, as well as data on the rate of denials of assistance, which can help inform the need for legal assistance on FEMA appeals. And finally, we work with bar associations and legal service providers as well. They play a very critical role in DLS to staff the hotlines, make referrals, and provide legal representation to individuals. We count with the support of the American Red Cross and other first responder groups, and representatives from state emergency management as well, who have information that can help inform the legal needs in the area. Next slide. The legal authority for the activation of a DLS program is in the Stafford Act, which provides that federal funds will be made available whenever the president determines that low-income individuals are unable to secure legal services that are adequate to meet their needs as a consequence of a major disaster. And for the purpose of defining eligibility for disaster legal services, low income is used to refer to disaster survivors who have insufficient resources to secure adequate legal services. And it doesn't matter whether that insufficiency existed before or was a result of the major disaster. This is all documented as well under the agency's individual assistance program. And also this information is available on FEMA's individual assistance program and policy guide. I believe it's page 8 that summarizes what disaster legal services does. And the way that we operationalize this is through a memorandum of agreement between the American Bar Association and FEMA. And then in turn, we partner with various legal aid groups, disaster responders, and bar associations to provide these services. Next slide. And actually, next slide, I think I summarized that as well. All right, so just to recap, and I like to emphasize this because this is a question that we often receive whenever there is a disaster. The Disaster Legal Services Program and the calls and the work that happens around that, anything we organize with FEMA to implement the program, that only happens if 3 requirements have been met. The first one is that there has to be a major disaster declaration approved by the president. The second one is the individual assistance program has been requested by a governor and approved as well by the president. And the third one is that FEMA makes a determination that free legal services are needed in the response of that disaster. That's when FEMA reaches out to our program to start the work around setting up a legal help hotline that FEMA staff can then share directly with survivors. And this, of course, does not prevent other legal service organizations from offering their services to assist disaster survivors. In fact, in most cases, we partner with organizations that have existing programs that assist disaster survivors to set up a hotline and also support any operations related to volunteer attorney recruitment or outreach. Next slide. We work, like I said, with a number of different groups. We set up a hotline that survivors who have legal questions can call, and they can receive legal information or legal assistance. And then we also help facilitate a forum based where the disaster has been declared, where disaster response stakeholders can discuss any issues that disaster survivors are facing. When FEMA reaches out to us to request disaster legal services, that usually comes from a federal coordinating officer at FEMA. They usually include the governor's request for disaster legal services along with the information on the impact that the disaster has caused. So the governor or the governor of the impacted area makes a preliminary damage assessment, and that's all documented in the request. And our program receives that so that we can have a better understanding of what the damage is and share that with partners so that they can coordinate around that and anticipate any needs based on that information. FEMA also authorizes funding to support the provision of these legal services, and that is a process that's led through the American Bar Association. And then finally, once things wrap up, which may be months after the disaster, the DLS program members create closeout reports where we document any lessons learned from the response and also any information relevant for a future disaster. Next slide. And in addition to, the hotline is set up, we announce that through a press release. Survivors may also learn about the program through a referral by a FEMA representative. Survivors who have also been denied assistance from FEMA receive what FEMA calls an agency referral letter, which includes information about disaster legal services. So our program, we have a national hotline number that routes callers to their respective states or territories if they're calling for legal assistance. And that national number is the one that's listed on that agency referral letter. We also coordinate with FEMA staff to have attorneys present at disaster recovery centers so survivors can learn more about the services available or ask questions about their particular situation. Next slide. Here's a kind of a sample partnership model from the legal response to Hurricane Ida in New York last year. This model is similar to other models that have been implemented in areas such as New Jersey, Oklahoma, Pennsylvania, and it's kind of just to represent the collaboration that happens behind the scenes to provide these legal services. Next slide. I think I covered that as well. Next slide. Here's a summary of where we have where we are currently supporting disaster legal help efforts. I know that there are other panelists who are speaking about the situation in Puerto Rico and Florida after me, but there are also other disaster implementations and response efforts happening in other areas such as Missouri, Alaska, and Oklahoma. Next slide. And then before I wrap up, I wanted to share just two new projects that our program is supporting. The first one is the FEMA Appeals Interactive Interview Tool, which allows disaster survivors to create and generate an appeal letter they can print or download to file directly with FEMA. This online tool was initially developed by Pro Bono Net in partnership with the City Bar Justice Center in the aftermath of Superstorm Sandy in 2012. And we've learned that it has helped over 14,000 survivors. I'm sure that number has changed because of Hurricanes Fiona and Ian, but it has over time helped that amount of survivors who have been impacted by disasters. This tool has also been updated over time to reflect changes in the application and appeals process with FEMA, including in 2021 when Pro Bono Net partnered with Disability Rights Texas to incorporate questions into the tool that address the needs of survivors with disabilities. A few weeks ago, the DLS program and Pro Bono Net announced the launch of the Spanish version of this tool, and if Sid hasn't already shared the links in the chat, it would be great if we can share that. And over the coming months, we will also be announcing a series of trainings associated with this FEMA appeals tool. So if you're interested in learning more about those trainings, feel free to reach out to me directly. And then finally, the next slide is another project that the DLS program is supporting. We have a Spanish translation hopefully coming out soon, which is the Spanish translation of a self-help resource called Figuring Out FEMA, which breaks down the process of registering for FEMA assistance, the Small Business Administration disaster loan process, and how to appeal a FEMA determination. So this source is available across different websites. Organizations can also order hard copies, or you can reach out to me, and we also have a few samples that we can share. And the next slide includes my contact information. Not sure if my email is not appearing there, but yes, feel free to reach out or ask the team at the National Low Income Housing Coalition if the connection is helpful.
Thank you so much, Jeannie. I know that legal aid groups have been incredibly helpful to survivors after disasters, especially around the appeals process. So I look forward to sharing your resources with more folks so that they can make use of it. Just one question before we move on, but what is really needed to bring this program up to scale and to make sure that all survivors who need access to legal services can get it?
I mean, it's spreading the word around the services available and really engaging, reaching out to our team and letting us know, how we can support legal service organizations that are now, providing legal services and learning about the legal issues in the area, where there has been a disaster. But certainly, spreading the word around the legal services available, and also if there is, information that we can provide to help other professionals, other advocates engaged in this space, learn about the legal issues, and we can communicate that would be helpful as well, just so we can continue to build on all of the work that the others are doing in this space.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate you joining with us today. And we'll move along to our next speaker, Javier Balmaceda, with the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, and I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, Sarah, and thanks to the Coalition for the invitation. It's great to be with you all today. Good afternoon. First off, I want to apologize for my slightly congested voice. I'm suffering from some pretty bad allergies since yesterday. I'm MDC, and apparently there's something called ragweed, which hits pretty hard in the fall, and it's quite brutal on my nose. So I will try to make it through this presentation with the least amount of sniffles. Anyways, let me quickly introduce myself. My name is Javier Balmaceda, pronouns he, him, his. I work for the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities as a senior policy analyst, and I focus mainly on the 5 U.S. territories, which are Puerto Rico, American Samoa, the U.S. Virgin Islands, Guam, and the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands. I myself was born and raised in Puerto Rico, just a quick personal tidbit. And for those of you that may be unfamiliar with my organization, also a very quick intro. The Center on Budget and Policy Priorities is a DC-based think tank, nonpartisan. We've been around for 40 years, a little over 40 years, since '81. And from the onset, we have advocated for the advancement of federal and state policies that guarantee that everyone in the U.S. has the necessary resources to thrive. Of course, the bulk of that mission has taken form in safeguarding and advocating for the expansion of some of the nation's largest economic and health security programs. So for instance, Medicaid, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP, many others, and of course some programs that are near and dear to this housing coalition, mainly the federal Section 8 rental assistance programs. As it relates to the U.S. territories, there is a contextual piece that I always like to lay out before jumping into more specifics. And it is essentially that the territories are not a monolith. It is true that they're all archipelagos, some based in the Pacific Ocean, others in the Atlantic. But geography aside, their histories and their peoples are very distinct. And so is the relationship that each one has with the federal government. And perhaps what is most tragic is that what can be generalized, what is true across the board, the one blanket statement that we can make is that the federal government historically has discriminated against the residents of these places in all sorts of ways, including the way it chooses to apply the safety net. And what that means essentially is that the federal government extends very limited resources to the territories to fund major economic, health, and security programs. Again, we're talking Medicaid, SNAP, the Supplemental Security Income, SSI, tax credits like the Earned Income Tax Credit and the Child Tax Credit, all sorts of programs. And, you know, the way I put it is that is tragically ironic because U.S. territories have by far the largest poverty rates in the nation. And so one would think, right, that the places that need these programs the most are the ones that would have the most access to them, but is actually quite the opposite. Getting into more technical budgety terms, which is what we do best at the center, the way that the federal government codifies these discriminatory limitations is basically through a collection of budgetary devices or gimmicks, if you will, that range from capped funding, where they impose arbitrary ceilings on the amount of money they assign to the territories to run these programs, or something that you may have heard about before because it comes up quite often in the context of the territories, which are called block grants. And block grants, quite simply, are a fixed and capped amount of funding. And this is usually what the federal government uses to fund all these major economic and health security programs in the territories. And of course, it goes without saying that never in the history of these programs has the federal government provided the territories with overly generous block grants. Quite the contrary, I mean, the federal government has massively underfunded the territories in this regard. So having given you all that context, which I think is very important, we can jump into the main topic, which focuses primarily on one territory, Puerto Rico, and one program, which is Medicaid. We published a blog post recently alerting that there is something called a Medicaid cliff coming up in December. I think Sid will share a copy of that. And by the way, Sid, I only gave you the English version. We have a Spanish version too, so I will post that after I'm done talking. So there's a Medicaid cliff coming up in December for Puerto Rico and the other territories for that matter. And let me just start by explaining what a cliff means. And I want to apologize too, I don't have any slides for this one. I tried creating visual aids, but I couldn't find any that quite capture what I'm about to say. So I apologize for the visual folks out there. And again, I'm always happy to follow up with questions or offline. So let me start with the word cliff, which essentially means that, again, because the territories get a limited amount of funding, the funding is about to expire this December for the territories and for the Medicaid programs. In the case of Medicaid, just taking a quick step back, you should know that there are two major pieces to how the program is funded. One is the allotment, and the other is the matching rate. Allotments are essentially the amount of annual financing that the federal government provides a state or a territory with to run the Medicaid program. And then you have the matching rate, also called the Federal Medical Assistance Percentage, or FMAP. And that is simply the amount of money that the federal government will match for every dollar invested into Medicaid. Now, there is a very important difference between states and territories when it comes to these two basic funding aspects. Mainly, states get open-ended funding, and that's because Medicaid works as something called an entitlement program. Territories get a capped and limited amount of funding because Medicaid works as a block grant there. And so in practice, what this means is that states will get as much funding as they need to cover their Medicaid needs, and territories just get a fixed amount of funding. And it doesn't matter whether it's enough or not, that's essentially all you get. The open-ended funding that states get is good to respond to all sorts of circumstances. On any given year, you might have rising poverty rates. You might have natural disasters like a hurricane, which Puerto Rico just went through with Fiona. And with the open-ended structure, states and the federal government can work together to increase the levels of funding, right, to address those needs. In the case of the territories, because the funding is capped, it is fixed, right? There's no way to increase the amount of funding to cover those needs. And this has historically been the case for the territories. Again, just to give you an example or perspective, Puerto Rico statutorily has a capped amount of funding of $400 million every year to fund Medicaid, $400 million. Puerto Rico, if it were treated as a state, would get something closer to $5 billion. So the gaps are massive. Because those gaps are massive, what Congress has done to try to address those gaps is through the years appropriate and allocate different pots of supplemental money. And this is where it gets tricky, right? Because Congress will do this in very unorthodox legislative vehicles. It's essentially different patches through time to try to cover the needs that the territories have in their programs. In the case of Puerto Rico, and I'm not going to get into too many details, in the case of Puerto Rico, there's a supplemental pot of money that will be expiring this December, and that's the subject of this blog post that we just put out. And once that funding expires, Puerto Rico will essentially drop down to the lower levels of funding that it usually has. And of course, these levels of funding are not nearly enough to fund a proper Medicaid program. In Puerto Rico, roughly 1.4 million people are part of the Medicaid program. The population for size is 3.2 million. So we're talking about 50% of the population is enrolled in the program. And so facing this funding cliff in December, it would be bad on any given day, on a normal day. But as you know, Puerto Rico has been through quite the ringer in the past couple of years. It went through 2 hurricanes in 2017, Irma and Maria. There were earthquakes in 2020. There was a pandemic, and now there's been another hurricane, Hurricane Fiona, which struck on September 18th. And so given all that context, right, and the systemic faults that we just talked about in the program, this coming cliff in December is very dire. And so we're asking Congress, we're imploring Congress to find a more permanent fix to the Medicaid programs, not just in Puerto Rico, but the territories as a whole. And I think with that, I will just wrap it up. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to field them. And thanks again for the chance to speak with you all today.
Thank you so much for joining, Javier. I appreciate you rooting us in the history of colonialism with many of the territories and how that's continuing today with Medicaid funding. I'm wondering if you could just expand a little on how can advocates who are on the call support your efforts to push for a legislative fix to this issue?
So I think that's a great question. First and foremost, I think it's creating awareness about the systemic limitations for the territories, which again, you would think are basic, but a lot of people up here in DC are not aware of them. And then secondly, point to the gaps and the fact that, you know, these are very necessary programs, not just for the territories, but as a, you know, as a whole. And again, the territories do have the highest poverty rates by far in the country. And so we need them in place to address many of the difficulties that these places are going through. So I think just going to Congress and asking for a permanent fix and also for parity and equity within these programs is the one ask really that we should all be making together.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I see that there are some comments and questions in the chat box. If you're able to stay on and answer those questions, I'd really appreciate it. And thank you again for joining. Right. We're going to shift gears now and turn our attention to disaster recovery efforts in Florida and Puerto Rico. And we will start, we'll start with Puerto Rico. I lied. We're going to start with Ariadna Michelle Goudreau-Aubert, who is with Ayuda Legal Puerto Rico and is a state partner for NLHC. I'm going to turn it over to you, Ariadna.
Hello, Sarah, and hi, everyone. Very grateful to be part of this conversation. So thank you, everyone, just for your continuous interest in Puerto Rico and what's going on with disaster recovery. So at Ayuda Legal Puerto Rico, we have been continuing celebrating brigades or legal clinics across the island, specifically in the southern parts of the island. Right now, we are a little bit concerned because we're waiting for floodings this whole week that are going to be making the conditions in the south, but also in other parts of the islands more vulnerable at this moment. Regarding FEMA assistance, we have been monitoring while we provide legal support to people on the ground and also advancing advocacy. We are concerned about the fact that we are finding many of the same red flags that we found with Maria, and afterwards with the earthquakes of 2020. Among them, the fact that we have families being denied, continuously denied for lack of verified ownership. We are also concerned about the fact that FEMA, even though a lot of organizations, including Ayuda Legal Puerto Rico and other groups at a federal level, have been asking FEMA to help people know, but also to use the self-declarative statement for lack of ownership, like alternative documentation. FEMA has not been willing to share documentation at the DRCs. So that basically is depending solely on the work of lawyers who may or may not be present at that moment. We're also worried about the fact that FEMA officials in DRCs and also people on the ground that represent FEMA are not proficient in Spanish, which means that there's a huge barrier, once again, that is basically excluding a lot of people in Puerto Rico who can't understand or speak English fluently. We are still working with very long waits, and this is related to the fact that English is still like being like the main or the only option that FEMA has to work with people like going through these disasters. We're dealing with long waits in the phone, and this may mean 3 hours to 7 hours wait. It's been a month after Fiona, so we are very concerned about the fact that this is maybe not going to change at any moment. We recently published, and I'm grateful that Jeannie was here before me. We recently published interactive form that basically lets people create not only the appeal to the FEMA denial, but also to create the supplementary documentation, including for those people who lack formal ownership at our website. It's ayudalegalpr.org. Although the website is, of course, customized for Puerto Rico, it could be very useful for jurisdictions where there's like not where LEP communities live. So you can find there like a lot of materials in Spanish. And if there's anything else that maybe you need and you can't find on the website that maybe we have, anything that has to do with disaster recovery, probably it's there. So we can find it, pull it up and send it to you so that you can only like customize it and use it any way that you may like. We're also going to be presenting this week the comments for the CDBG-DR 9th review of the action plan. Basically, the government of Puerto Rico, 2 days before Fiona on September 16, published and started like a comment period for the 9th version of the CDBG-DR action plan, which basically allocates $9.7 billion to disaster survivors of Hurricane Irma and Maria. One of the things that the department is proposing as part of that amendment is to eliminate the blue tarp repair program. As many of you know, blue tarps or blue roofs are still like a huge issue in Puerto Rico. In 2020, the government was saying that we had around 15,000 to 18,000 blue tarps. That number diminished for some reason that nobody on the ground understands. And it's the fact that the official number that they have been using is 3,600. Advocates who are on the ground, we know that number is not possible, but that's the number that the government has been using. And we wanted like to stress the fact that the government, 1 year after opening a blue tarp program, is proposing to eliminate that program and to shift it into a census program to know how many blue tarps we have on the ground. As housing advocates, we are a little bit concerned about the fact that it's been 5 years after Maria and you're still dedicating funding for census and for to know how many blue tarps are on the ground, while you're saying that you already know how many tarps we have on the ground, while the repair program for people who are still waiting for a dignified housing is still very, very, very slow. So in a year of having that program opened, not a single blue tarp was solved with this funding. And what we're talking about is a lot of improvisation for people on the ground who have been now affected not only by the earthquakes after Maria, but now with Fiona, and who are very concerned about their possibilities of actually staying in Puerto Rico. The local government, the legislature is celebrating new hearings on the CDBG-DR process, basically housing programs. And we had the chance to participate yesterday, and we are seeing an increased interest on mandating through local law, local legislation, accountability and audit process of contractors, which is something that we have been asking for a while. So that we can actually like have a clear picture of how our contractors like working on the ground, what are they doing with the CDBG-DR funding, what are the metrics, the benchmarks, how are they being assessed by the Department of Housing, and most important, what's going to be the timeline so that people can have like a guarantee of dignified housing by the time this funding like runs out, which is September 2026. So we're working with that. We are going to be like, we can share like with Sarah, as I said, please visit ayudalegalpr.org if you have a LEP population that maybe at Ayuda Legal we can help. All of our materials like are free to be distributed, so please use them, ask us about it. And as always, like thank you so much like for having us here.
Thank you so much, Ariadna. It's really disconcerting to hear from you about the same problems playing out in Puerto Rico over and over and over again with each disaster, especially around the title issues that we, FEMA had made some progress on, but it only really matters if it's making a difference for people on the ground. So I appreciate you lifting that up. A lot of these problems I think might be better off if there was community oversight and community input into programs. I know that's something that your organization has really led the charge on. Can you talk a little bit about how that could look, that community oversight could look, and what impact it could have?
Yeah, of course, Sarah. We have been asking for a while for the CDPGDR or the whole recovery process to have an oversight process that's carried out by civilians. Thinking about, that idea that was like a very widespread of the police reforms in Puerto Rico and elsewhere, where civilian oversight bodies had not only a chance to demand accountability, but also to veto practices that could go against the objectives of the initiative. So, of course, the government of Puerto Rico has been very close to that idea. We got in the allocation notice for the mitigation funds, there was like a huge win, which was including civilian advisory committee as part of the allocation notice. But basically what has happened is that the PRDOH, the local Department of Housing, has been using like the bare minimum of compliance, which is 2 meetings along the process to say that they have complied with community participation. HUD is saying that they are complying because they are basically making the 2 meetings happen, which are like PowerPoint presentations. But what we're asking also is examples from other jurisdictions. We know that there was something similar in Sandy, which can like talk about how can we shift power dynamics when we're talking about recovery, which is always like not something like for comment periods of public hearings or meetings with PowerPoint presentations, but that is an ongoing process of accountability, and also the power of the people, like to be able to veto and to look into the programs, not only to provide information, but also to actually influence what's going on in the ground. So we are in that process. The community advisory committee is not working. Ayuda Legal Puerto Rico decided not to participate and not to be part of that process because it's basically PowerPoint presentations, and we're not going to be like basically a stamp at the end of the participatory requirement that HUD places on the local Department of Housing. But we are willing to learn more because we think this is a fight that we need to, to give.
Thank you so much, Ariadna. Yeah, there's certainly a difference between checking a box and real sustained engagement with the community. So I appreciate that. We're going to move on to our next speaker from Florida, Kathy Grunwald from the Legal Services of North Florida, who can share an update about what is happening on the ground there. I'll turn it over to you, Kathy.
All right, thank you, Sarah, and thank you for asking me to come back to the call after about 2 weeks when I was here before. At that time, we were very much in response and mass care mode. Now in Florida, after Hurricane Ian, we're slowing down on mass care, winding that down, but ramping up on recovery and long-term recovery. And so I thought I'd give you an idea of where we are in this state right now, what kind of legal problems our attorneys in the impacted area are seeing, and what's going on right now in Florida with Hurricane Ian. First of all, we have 77 counties in Florida, and 26 of them have been declared for individual assistance. We started opening, or FEMA started opening the disaster recovery centers a couple of weeks ago. We have 18 different disaster recovery centers right now with 5 more opening this week. The programs that serve that area are in the disaster recovery centers, meeting clients and assisting them with their legal issues, and also encouraging pro bono volunteers to come in and sit in the disaster recovery center to meet people. Those are open 7 days a week, I think usually from 8 to 6 o'clock, and it's a one-stop shop if you know disaster recovery center. So FEMA is going to be in there, and that's an opportunity for people to ask them questions. Our DSNAP program got started after our last call, and it's working in 3 phases by county. So in Florida, they want you and suggest strongly that you register online, and then they give everybody a day, depending on their last name, to call to do a telephone interview. And if everything goes through, then they receive their EBT card for DSNAP. For those people who cannot register online, they are having on-site registrations and interviews that they're setting up for over a long weekend or 3 days. People can go there, they can pre-register, and they can get the DSNAP card. We have disaster unemployment assistance that's been going for the same amount of time. Not as many. There've been a lot of people who've applied for that, but like I think I'm looking here about 4,000, but so far only 114 have been approved. But if you know Florida, you know reemployment assistance and disaster unemployment assistance sometimes hard to get through to complete your application. We still have 8 shelters open of the shelters that opened right before the storm, with but about 1,000 people are in those shelters right now. We do have in Florida transitional sheltering assistance, and 2,000, a little over 2,000 households are in those hotels and motels. I believe it's like 230 hotels and motels that are taking folks in Florida, Georgia, and Alabama. And FEMA reported a couple last week that there are 237 households. That's about 5,000 people, but there are 53,000 people that are eligible. So I don't know how that's going to work out for the other 53,000. I suspect not well. They've gotten already, FEMA, over 734 registrations. Last week, a FEMA representative said the 5 top reasons for denial of assistance are no damage, insufficient damage, occupancy not verified, ownership not verified, and they said location. I'm not actually sure what location is. I was on a call yesterday with all of the programs in Florida and those that are working in the impacted area. Some people had thought that it might be related to in Florida. Your zip code can go from one county and can cover 2 counties, and one of them may not be an impacted county. Some people may be using the wrong address, maybe where they're staying, and not their damaged property address. And then a whole lot of people have applied from non-designated counties, from one of the other 51 counties in Florida. So yesterday, as I said, what we call the disaster working group for the state for Florida of legal services organizations met, and we had people from most of the programs that are working on the ground right now, and to talk about the kinds of legal problems that they're seeing. And as you might expect, the #1 problem is still landlord-tenant questions, issues, and evictions. particularly landlords attempting self-help evictions. And so in Florida, we have a casualty provision in our landlord-tenant law that gives that the right to end a tenancy after a disaster to the tenant, not to the landlord. So we've been doing some community education and outreach and intervening in the situations to assist clients, and in some cases to get clients whose leases are ending a little extra time to be where they are to eventually before they have to move out and need to find another place to go. And of course, insurance is now coming up. This is a place where we use pro bono attorneys. Most of us legal services aren't experts on insurance, but we're getting people just questions about filing claims, insurance awards, and how that interacts with their FEMA assistance. And so, of course, a big part of that is, I hate to say this, but lowering expectations of what you might expect to recover from FEMA and maybe even your insurance company. I don't know if this is the case for everyone, but in Florida, you can have homeowners insurance, but you need a separate policy for wind. So some people may have homeowners, but not wind, so their recovery is zero. And of course, there's the impact of whether or not people have flood insurance. And then people love to come to Florida after a disaster because fraud follows disasters. And we're seeing a lot of contractors who are coming in who are not licensed in Florida, and other workers who are getting people to pay for things that they should be able to get without paying from a nonprofit organization or the state, such as debris removal or cutting up a tree that's falling on their yard or fallen on their yard, or maybe putting on a roof. And so talking to people about their contracts, trying to help people get out of their contracts or cancel them is coming up more and more. And of course, people are starting to get their FEMA decisions. And so FEMA appeals is becoming a big issue with our programs right now. And then lastly, we're apparently going to get this RUSH program, which will be wonderful for the state of Florida and 7 impacted localities, which is some counties and some cities, that will help those who are homeless or may experience or nearing homelessness, perhaps find a place that they can stay. That's it for me. That was quick.
Thank you so much, Kathy. I just want to make sure I heard you, because you shared a lot of really good information with us, but that 53,000 people are eligible for FEMA's TSA hotel program, but only 2,000 people are currently being housed that way.
2,037 households. So it's closer to 5,000 actual people, because it's families, you know, that may be in there. And it's the FEMA rep who said there were 53,000 that were eligible.
That's certainly very concerning, obviously, because people who are displaced typically use that FEMA TSA program. But as we know, there are huge barriers, especially for low-income people who might not have credit cards to put on file or security to put deposits, who face discrimination that hotels don't necessarily want to allow their units to be used that way. I really appreciate you sharing this information, and hopefully we can hear back from you soon about how you're seeing the RUSH program be used in your community. And as I mentioned earlier, we'll have someone from HUD join us next week to share more details about that program. So thank you so much, Kathy.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Great. And now we're going to turn over to Noah Patton with NLHC, who can share a little bit more about some legislative work that we've been doing.
How's it going, everybody? Noah Patton, Housing Policy Analyst at the National Low Income Housing Coalition. So today, just for our last little bit here, going to be talking about our efforts around open FEMA. So I can take the next slide in the deck. There you go. Yeah, so you may have, if you've been tuning into Disaster Hazard Recovery Coalition events and webinars before, you may have heard the word open FEMA said before. And you know, open FEMA is essentially a data clearinghouse for FEMA programs. So historically, it's been very difficult to get information about outcomes out of FEMA. You know, who's, you know, approval rates, rehousing rates, program enrollment, and that sort of thing. And typically the agency is utilized, you know, a bit of a cherry picking strategy on what data they choose to release. And that being said, they do maintain this kind of website on the FEMA website that has a large number of data sets that covers a wide variety of FEMA programs. And for our purposes today, we'll specifically be focusing on the data sets surrounding FEMA's individual assistance program. So currently we utilize these open FEMA data sets, which kind of tell you the rate of approvals, how many approvals applicants in a certain county have made, the kind of levels of assistance that they have received and that sort of thing. And we use that to kind of gauge what are the reasons for FEMA denials, where are, you know, there's a very dense pocket of people applying for FEMA assistance, and we use that not only for, you know, federal level advocacy, but also folks on the ground can utilize that to kind of get some takeaways about the recovery process, as well as, you know, the damage of a disaster. So that all being said, the data offered by FEMA on open FEMA is very limited and could be directly improved and kind of allow us as advocates and community members and disaster survivors to really better understand where the needs are following a disaster and what kind of cracks or what kind of gaps in our federal disaster response are occurring and how best to address those. So specifically, we were able to send just recently, just last week, a letter to FEMA requesting these improvements. So I just wanted to kind of quickly run down them and just kind of let you all know what we are asking for. And specifically, you know, we're asking, probably, you know, most importantly would be that the agency make public key data on race and other demographics. FEMA, for the longest time, was not collecting information on race or ethnicity for its disaster recovery programs, which of course makes it exceptionally difficult to figure out if there is an equity issue within FEMA regarding certain races or ethnicities. FEMA, to its credit, earlier this year announced that they would start collecting that information on a voluntary basis from disaster applicants, but informed us that they would not be making this information public. So first and foremost would be that Open FEMA include that information on Open FEMA. In addition, just kind of a more granular level of information possible, and that kind of allows us to analyze disaster impacts and recovery impacts by census block instead of by county. You know, collect better information on disaster mitigation funding. You know, when a data set is erroneous, don't just yank it from the website, but actually keep those erroneous data somewhere else on the website indicated as the data being incorrect, so we can kind of analyze what changes were made that made that data erroneous. And then just provide additional data sets in interactive formats, not just data formats that you would need a computer science degree to figure out, but actually, you know, visualizations and things like that that would allow disaster survivors to very easily understand the scope of the recovery process and how that recovery process is going. Right now, You know, they keep most of this information on a very, very large 6 to, I think, 8 gigabyte Excel spreadsheet that will most certainly crash your laptop if you attempt to open it, and I can speak from experience there. So just having, you know, and more accessible data on that website would be just so crucial. And that's kind of what we'll be pushing for ongoing when it comes to Open FEMA. If you've been attending these calls frequently, we use our partners over at Texas Appleseed use Open FEMA to create those very lovely maps of FEMA individual assistance and that sort of thing. So I could just take the next slide. And I'll just say as a reminder, you know, our national calls will be ongoing on Tuesdays, talking about Hurricane Fiona, Hurricane Ian, active disaster recovery efforts. And then we host our disaster recovery working group weekdays on Wednesdays at 2 p.m., talking a little bit more about the nitty gritty. And then we have the Puerto Rico working group specifically at Thursdays at 3. And that's about it. I'll just turn it back over to you, Sarah.
Great. Thank you so much, Noah. And we'll see everybody next week. Talk to you soon.